There is a kind of distance that does not arrive with an argument or with a clear goodbye. It arrives in silence. One day, everything seems normal. Conversations continue at their usual pace. Messages arrive. Replies appear. But little by little, something changes. It is not something you can point to exactly. It is more like a feeling. Replies take longer. Conversations become shorter. The enthusiasm disappears. And then the moment comes when you realize that something is no longer the same. Maybe that person no longer writes like before. Maybe they respond with brief sentences. Or perhaps they stop responding altogether. There is no direct explanation. There is no conversation that closes the cycle. There is only silence. And silence has something very particular about it. It leaves space for the mind to fill it. When someone distances themselves without explanation, the emptiness they leave behind is not only emotional, it is also mental. The human brain is not designed to tolerate uncertainty well, especially when it comes to important relationships. That is when the questions begin. Did I do something wrong? Did I say something I shouldn't have? Why did everything suddenly change? The mind starts reviewing memories as if they were pieces of a puzzle. Past conversations, old messages, moments that once seemed normal and are now analyzed as if they contained a signal you failed to see. You try to find the exact moment when something broke. But many times that moment never appears. And that is what makes the experience so disorienting. When someone leaves after an argument, at least there is a reference point. Something that explains, even partially, what happened. But when someone disappears without saying anything, what remains is a feeling of interruption, as if a story had been left halfway through a sentence. The relationship did not end with a conversation. It ended with a void. And that void is often filled with a very common emotion. Doubt about oneself. Not necessarily because you did something wrong, but because when there are no external answers, the mind begins to look for them inside. But before trying to understand why someone left, there is something important to understand. Because the true impact of these situations is not always in the distance of the other person. Very often it lies in what begins to happen inside us when that silence appears. When someone distances themselves without explanation, the impact does not occur only in the relationship. It also happens inside your mind. Human relationships function like stories. They have a beginning, a development, and usually a closing. Even when a relationship ends badly, there is usually a final conversation, an argument, or some kind of explanation that allows you to understand what happened. But when someone disappears without saying anything, that closure does not exist. And the human brain has great difficulty accepting unfinished stories. Our minds need to understand what happens around us. They need to find causes, reasons, and meaning. When something important happens without explanation, the brain enters a constant state of searching. That is why many people begin mentally reviewing everything that happened before that person pulled away. They remember conversations. They reread old messages. They try to identify the exact moment when everything changed. They do not do this simply out of nostalgia. They do it because their mind is trying to find an answer that closes the cycle. The problem is that in the absence of a real explanation, the brain begins to construct its own theories. And many times those theories point toward oneself. Thoughts begin to appear such as, maybe I said something that bothered them. Perhaps I was too insistent. Or maybe I just wasn't important enough. It is an almost automatic process. When someone leaves without explaining why, the mind looks for a reason. And if it cannot find a clear external explanation, it tends to look inward. This has an important psychological explanation. Relationships activate deep parts of our identity. When someone close suddenly distances themselves, the brain interprets that loss not only as distance, but as a potential threat to the bond. And when the bond breaks without explanation, an uncomfortable sense of uncertainty appears. Uncertainty is one of the most difficult emotions for the human mind to tolerate. Not knowing why something happened can be more distressing than receiving a painful answer, because at least an answer allows the story to close. Without that explanation, the mind remains trapped in a cycle of questions. You try to move forward, but suddenly a memory appears, a phrase, a shared moment, and the mind returns to the same place, trying to understand what happened. It is like there was a conversation that was supposed to happen, but never did. Many people believe that what they want is to recover the other person, but in many cases, what they are actually searching for is something much simpler: understanding. They want to know what happened, so they can give meaning to the experience. However, there is an important detail that often goes unnoticed. Even though the mind searches for answers in the past, the real impact of these situations is usually not the lack of information. It is the interpretation we make of that silence. Because when someone disappears without explanation, we do not only stop receiving their words, we also begin to build a story about what that silence means for us. When someone walks away without explanation, there is a moment when the mind changes direction. At first, it tries to understand what happened. It searches for signals, reviews memories, tries to reconstruct the story. But when it cannot find a clear answer, it begins to do something very common and deeply human. It begins to look inward. And this is where one of the most painful mistakes many people make appears without them even realizing it. Transforming the other person's decision into a conclusion about their own worth. Suddenly, the other person's silence becomes a mirror, and that mirror begins to reflect uncomfortable questions. Maybe I was too intense. Maybe I said something I shouldn't have. Maybe I wasn't enough. These ideas rarely appear all at once. They settle in gradually. Every memory revisited, every conversation analyzed, every moment reinterpreted begins to feed an internal story. A story that says, if they left, something in me must have failed. This process has an important psychological explanation. Human beings have a natural tendency to seek control over what happens in our relationships. And one unconscious way of feeling that we have control is to believe the problem was something we did. Because if the problem was something you did, then there is the possibility that you could have acted differently. You could have said something else. You could have avoided the outcome. Paradoxically, assuming the blame can create a false sense of order. It makes the story seem logical, even if it is painful. But many times that logic is not real. Human relationships are complex. Each person carries their own emotional history, their own fears, their own wounds, and their own ways of dealing with conflict. When someone walks away without explaining what happened, that decision often has more to do with their way of handling emotions than with a specific flaw in the other person. Some people, for example, struggle to express what they feel. Talking about conflict, doubt, or emotional changes feels uncomfortable to them. Instead of facing a difficult conversation, they slowly withdraw. Others simply do not know how to end a relationship in a mature way. They avoid the uncomfortable moment of explaining their reasons because they do not want to face the other person's reaction, or because they do not know how to deal with the guilt that might arise. There are also people who go through internal processes they themselves cannot explain. Personal changes, fears, insecurities, or decisions made without complete clarity about what they feel. But when someone leaves without explanation, that complexity cannot be seen from the outside. All that is visible is silence. And silence, if not understood correctly, can become a silent accusation against oneself. That is where the real emotional danger of these situations appears. Not in the distance of the other person, but in the story you construct about what that distance means for you. Because if you begin to believe that someone left because you were not enough, that idea can stay in your mind for a long time. It can affect your confidence, the way you relate to others, and your emotional security in future relationships. However, there is something important to remember. The way someone chooses to leave says much more about how they handle relationships than about your value as a person. Emotional maturity is not only shown in how someone begins a relationship, but also in how they choose to end it. Explaining what is happening, speaking honestly, and closing cycles with respect requires courage and emotional responsibility. When someone leaves without offering that closure, it does not necessarily reveal a failure in you. Many times it reveals a difficulty in them to face uncomfortable emotions. Understanding this does not eliminate the pain of distance, but it can help you see the situation from a fairer perspective. Because before asking what you did wrong, perhaps the more important question is this: why do some people prefer to disappear rather than have an honest conversation? When someone walks away without explanation, it is natural to think that the reason must be something very clear, something specific that happened. A mistake, an argument, or an obvious change. But in many cases, the reason is not that simple. Some people do not leave because they want to hurt others. They leave because they do not know how to face certain emotions. Talking about what we feel is not always easy. Expressing doubts, discomfort, or the desire to create distance can generate guilt, fear, or anxiety. For many people, having that conversation means facing an emotionally uncomfortable moment, and not everyone knows how to handle that discomfort. There are people who have learned, consciously or unconsciously, to avoid conflict. They prefer to distance themselves gradually rather than explain what is happening. They believe disappearing will be easier than having a difficult conversation. From their perspective, silence may seem like a way to avoid drama or pain. But what for them is a way to escape an uncomfortable situation becomes something very different for the other person. It becomes uncertainty. Because when someone disappears without saying anything, they leave an open story. There is no explanation that allows you to understand what happened. There are no words that help process the distance. Only a feeling of interruption remains. There is also another important factor. Many people simply do not have the emotional tools to close relationships clearly. They do not know how to say that something has changed. They do not know how to express that they no longer feel the same or that they need to take another path. So they choose the exit that requires the least confrontation: distance. This does not mean that this way of acting is fair or mature. It simply reflects the way that person manages their own emotions. And here something important appears. The way someone chooses to leave says a lot about their level of emotional responsibility. Disappearing without giving explanations may avoid an uncomfortable moment, but it leaves an emotional burden on the other person. That is why it is so difficult to accept this type of distance. Because you do not only lose someone, you also lose the opportunity to understand what happened. And when there is no understanding, the mind tries to fill that void on its own. But even when the other person does not provide answers, there is still something that remains in your hands. The way you decide to close that story within yourself. After going through loneliness, the breaking point, fear, and the process of rebuilding yourself from the inside, you arrive at a different place. It is not a loud or dramatic place. It is not a victory that the world celebrates. It is something much quieter, but also much more powerful. It is freedom. But not the superficial freedom that we sometimes hear in quick phrases like, "I don't need anyone." That idea often comes from wounded pride or from fear of feeling pain again. True emotional freedom is something else. It is knowing that you can be alone without feeling abandoned. There is a huge difference between being alone and feeling alone. At the beginning of the process, solitude feels heavy because it feels like absence. Absence of support. Absence of understanding. Absence of someone who is there when you need them most. That absence hurts because it breaks deep expectations. The idea that when life becomes difficult, someone will be there to hold you. But when you begin to build your own inner stability, something changes. Solitude stops being abandonment and begins to become space. Space to listen to yourself. Space to think clearly. Space to make decisions without the constant pressure to please others. Imagine someone, let's call her Sophia, who for years lived emotionally dependent on the validation of others. If her partner doubted her, Sophia doubted herself too. If her friends did not approve of a decision, she cancelled it. If she did not receive external enthusiasm, her motivation disappeared. Her compass was always outside. But after going through disappointments, painful silences, and moments when no one seemed to be available for her, Sophia began to develop something new. Inner stability. At first it was uncomfortable. Making decisions without consulting everyone felt strange. Moving forward without external guarantees made her feel insecure. There were days when she wondered if she was really doing the right thing. But over time, she began to notice something unexpected. When she did something aligned with her values, even if no one celebrated it, she felt calm. Not euphoria, not exaggerated pride, just calm. And that calm is one of the deepest forms of emotional freedom, because it means you no longer need the world to validate every step you take. When you stop depending completely on external approval, your decisions change in quality. Before, you acted reacting to what others thought. Now you begin to act from personal coherence. Your actions are no longer trying to prove anything. They begin to express who you are. This also transforms your relationship with success and failure. Before, failure could feel devastating because it seemed to confirm all the doubts you had about yourself. But when your stability comes from within, failure changes meaning. It stops being a sentence about your worth. It becomes information. Success, on the other hand, also loses its exaggerated power. It no longer defines who you are. It simply becomes a consequence of the decisions you make. This freedom also deeply changes the way you relate to others. When you depended emotionally on the constant support of others, relationships could feel intense and sometimes anxious. You needed constant signs of security. You needed confirmation. You needed to feel that you were not alone. Now something different happens. When you know how to hold yourself, you choose companionship from desire, not from necessity. You are not with someone because you fear being alone. You are there because you want to share. You do not desperately seek approval. You seek genuine connection. This is the difference between isolation and emotional autonomy. Isolation comes from the fear of being hurt again. Autonomy comes from inner security. Sophia did not stop wanting relationships. She did not stop valuing support. But she stopped turning people into the only support for her emotional stability. And that changed everything. Because when you no longer need someone to hold you in order to exist, you can love with less fear. Moving forward when no one is by your side does not mean walking through life alone forever. It means that even when no one is present in a difficult moment, you are still there for yourself. That inner presence is the foundation of true emotional freedom. It also changes your relationship with effort. Before, moving forward alone could feel unfair. You might think, why do I have to do everything myself? Why does no one support me when I need it? But over time, effort begins to feel different. Not as punishment, but as growth. You discover that the strength you have developed did not appear by chance. It was born from having gone through discomfort, silence, doubts, and moments when it seemed like no one was watching. And then you understand something important. Freedom does not mean that no one will ever fail you. It means knowing that even if someone fails you, you will not abandon yourself. When you reach that point, solitude stops being a threat. It becomes a space where you can breathe, think, and rebuild yourself. And from that space, you can create something much healthier: chosen relationships, coherent decisions, and a life that does not depend entirely on external approval. Moving forward, even when no one is by your side, does not mean giving up on others. It means not giving up on yourself. And when you learn not to abandon yourself, even in the quietest moments, you discover something that no one can take away from you: your ability to sustain your own path. That is the freedom that does not depend on anyone. If you liked this story, if at any moment you felt it resonated with you or touched something in your heart, I would love to read you in the comments. Tell me if you learned something today, or which part of this story resembles your own life. And if you want to keep receiving these small reminders that can accompany you and help you in your daily life, don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Thank you for being here, for taking this moment of calm. See you in the next video.